As the media and technology became more normalized, Americans became more aware of the progression of the civil rights movement. The beginning of the civil rights movement renewed progress towards racial equality in the 40s, causing an increase in white resentment into the 50s. This furthered black rights movements. Legal support for desegregation increased, and the advancement of media brought national attention to racial violence in the South.
In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled that segregated public education was unconstitutional and illegal. This decision was made under unanimous vote in the Brown v. Board of Education case. Since this decision was by the Supreme Court, it set a standard for all other cases to stop segregation. The previous case regarding segregation in public schools was Plessy v. Ferguson, a case decided in 1896 that ruled that all schools could remain segregated as long as they were equal. The Brown v. Board of Education case changed this idea because it ruled that separate educational facilities were inherently unequal. Expert witness at the trial Hugh Spear argued that if the colored children are denied the experience in school of associating with white children, who represent 90% of our national society in which these colored children must live, then the colored child's curriculum is being greatly curtailed. The Topeka curriculum, or any school curriculum, cannot be equal under segregation. This inequality was a violation of the 14th Amendment, and the combination of these ideas meant that the Plessy v. Ferguson case was overturned. The Board of Education argued that segregation in schools prepared blacks for their life after school, which would also include segregation, and they referenced many successful African Americans who had gone through public schooling to become successful. However, these arguments did not work well, and the Supreme Court voted unanimously to end segregation in public schooling. This decision was not respected by many local governments, and it was harshly resisted in some locations. Over 100 Southern politicians signed a manifesto to resist the integration and used their power to resist desegregation in any way possible. For example, in Virginia, tax cuts were given to people who sent their children to segregated schools, and the state government would often cut the funding and close any school that tried to integrate black children. The state took the power to assign students to schools from local school boards and used it to make sure there would be no blacks assigned to all white schools.
Regardless of the fact that the Brown versus Board of Education led to desegregation, racial tensions didn't miraculously end and were still highly prominent in the South. It infuriated a majority of the white population and violence rose. The infamous death of Emmett Till was a direct representation of the tragic lynchings that regularly occurred in the South. Emmett Till was murdered for allegedly flirting with a white woman while visiting his family in Money, Mississippi. After a long, hot day of picking cotton, Emmett joins a group of teens to buy refreshments at Brian's Grocery and Meat Market. No one will ever know exactly what happened inside the store. However, it is known that Emmett buys bubblegum, and some of his friends that are with him will later on report that he whistled, flirted, or touched the hand of Carolyn Bryant, the female clerk and wife of the owner. 4 days later, at around 2:30 in the morning, Rob Bryant, Carolyn's husband, and J.W. Millam, his half-brother, arrive at Moses Wright's house where Emmett is staying. They kidnap him and drive him to the Tallahatchie River. They make him carry a 75-pound cotton gin to the bank and take off his clothes. They brutally beat him, gouge out his eye, and shoot him in the head. Then they tie his body to the cotton gin and throw him into the river. 3 days later, his body is found. His body is so distorted his uncle could only tell it was him by the initials on a ring his mother had given him before he left. Authorities want the body buried as soon as possible, but Mamie Till, Emmett's mother, demands that the body be sent back to Chicago. She holds an open casket funeral so that everyone can see what they had done to her son. Thousands gather to see Emmett's distorted remains. Various amounts of magazines such as Jet features pictures of Emmett Till's body, which outraged African Americans from coast to coast and gained white sympathy. Millam and Bryant went to trial, but the all-white jury decided that the government had failed to identify the body, so they weren't guilty. The outcome spawned feelings ranging from outrage to inspiration. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 was passed as a result of Emmett Till's death, which allowed the U.S. Department of Justice to intervene whenever civil rights were being compromised. The death of Emmett Till also made Northern blacks realize that violence that occurred to blacks in the South could affect them too. It would be 100 days after his death that a woman named Rosa Parks would take a defiant stand against white supremacy, which would spark a bus boycott that would change the city's segregation policies forever.
The Montgomery bus boycott started in December of 1955 when Rosa Parks, an active NAACP member, refused to move further to the back of the bus in order for a white man to take the seat. The row that she was in was the first row that blacks were usually able to sit in, but all the rows were filled, so she was told to move, which she refused. The boycott started on Rosa Parks' court date, which was just a few months after Emmett Till's horrific murder. The leaders of the boycott founded the Montgomery Improvement Association and elected Martin Luther King Jr. as its leader. He demanded that blacks be able to sit wherever they want on the buses, ending the racial segregation very prevalent on the buses. During the boycott, blacks found other means of transportation, including carpools and taxis, which greatly influenced the bus's income, as they made up to 75% of the total population who rode the buses. Various white supremacy groups, such as the Ku Klux Klan, held rallies during the boycott. However, the blacks in the boycott never resorted to violence. Eventually, the case went to the Montgomery Federal Court, which sided with the blacks, ruling that buses were to become integrated, as the continued segregation on buses violated the 14th Amendment. The city appealed to the Supreme Court, which again ruled for integration of buses, stating that the continued segregation on buses based on race was unconstitutional. After more than a year, on December 21st, 1956, the boycott ended and blacks were allowed to sit wherever they wanted to on buses for the first time. The boycott showed blacks that forms of nonviolent and peaceful protests work. In addition, it showed the community the immense economic worth of blacks, as during the boycott, the buses were not making enough money and going out of business. In addition, as Martin Luther King Jr. led the boycott, he gained more respect as a civil rights leader, and more attention was given to the civil rights movement. Much like the Brown v. Board of Ed case, blacks fought for their rights as equal citizens and against racial segregation, and won the case along with their rights that they deserved as American citizens.
The Southern Christian Leadership Conference is an African-American civil rights organization founded in Atlanta by Martin Luther King Jr. in 1957. Its goal was to redeem the soul of America without using violence, because it viewed discrimination and racism as a spiritual issue that needed to be addressed using Christianity. As opposed to recruiting individuals for membership, the SCLC collaborated with other black rights organizations in its campaigns. Other influential SCLC leaders are Coretta Scott King, Andrew Young, Ralph Abernathy, and Joseph Lowry. Many factors played into the formation of the SCLC. In general, black Southern churches were becoming very powerful social institutions, and black men were much more involved in politics since the Democrats regained control of Congress in 1954. The Brown v. Board of Education ruling in favor of desegregation rallied up support for a national collaboration to improve black rights and strengthened an incentive to desegregate public schools. More specifically, the Montgomery bus boycott is considered to be the catalyst for the formation of the SCLC. The extreme success of the boycott boosted the morale of civil rights leaders in the South and caused them to consider an extension of this success throughout other Southern states. Although the SCLC was formed in Georgia, its intention from the start was to expand its influence throughout the country, which it worked towards throughout its duration. The lasting effect of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was a more publicized, individual support and sympathy for African American rights, bringing racial equality to a greater, more realistic national prominence. This was exemplified by Martin Luther King Jr.'s sit-in at the segregated Magnolia Tea Room in October of 1960. His arrest led to personal attention from presidential candidate John F. Kennedy, who made a personal effort to drop King's charges. This highly publicized presidential attention wouldn't have been possible without the developing technology of the 50s, and it was very beneficial for the growing civil rights movement.
During the American Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s, Little Rock Central High School was the site of a forced school desegregation. A group of African American students nicknamed the Little Rock Nine enrolled in the high school in 1957 and were initially prevented to attend the school by Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus. 3 years prior to the Little Rock crisis, during the Brown versus Board of Education case, the United States Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional and wrong to segregate schools and that it violated the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. As schools across the South started desegregating their facilities, Little Rock Central High was ordered by the federal government to comply with the Supreme Court's decision 3 years before. On the first day of school on September 4, 1957, the 9 black students were blocked by an angry white mob. Governor Faubus, who was strongly against integration of schools, deployed the Arkansas National Guard to prevent the African American kids from entering. This shows how some people in the South were very strongly opposed to freedom and rights for blacks during the time period. People such as Governor Faubus were willing to defy national laws and orders to use resources they have as they see fit in order to prevent African Americans from taking part in actions that would make them more equal to the white population. After a meeting with President Eisenhower, Faubus agreed to use the National Guard to protect the black students. Upon returning to Little Rock, Faubus went against his word and dismissed the National Guard, leaving the 9 students exposed to a large, angry white mob. At this point, President Eisenhower stepped in and took control of the situation by assigning the 101st Airborne Division paratroopers to escort and protect the black students. They were then able to finish out the school year. This event was important in the advancement of civil rights movements because it helped break down the walls of segregation and help mix and bring together populations with varying skin colors. It also showed the influence that the Supreme Court's decision in the Brown versus Board of Education case was able to slowly make throughout the country. Martin Luther King thanked Eisenhower for his efforts, saying, "I wish to express my sincere support for the stand you have taken to restore law and order in Little Rock, Arkansas. You should know that the overwhelming majority of Southerners, Negro and white, stand firmly behind your resolute action."
The civil rights movement of the 1950s was full of connections. The Brown versus Board of Education case, which provided legal support for desegregation, caused many local politicians to protest the decision. This led to the Little Rock Central High School conflict. This gained worldwide media coverage, which increased the media coverage of the civil rights movement. The Brown versus Board of Education case also created legal support for desegregation, creating incentive for an organization to support it and make sure that this legal standpoint was maintained. This led to the formation of the SCLC. The Brown versus Board of Education case also furthered the fight against segregation, causing Rosa Parks to stand up for her rights, and that caused the Montgomery bus boycott. As bus finances collapsed because of the boycott, the importance of blacks in the economy was shown. This led to increased media coverage of the civil rights movement. The Brown versus Board of Education case also created racial tensions and increased violence, especially in the South. This led to incidents like Emmett Till's death. His murder inspired Rosa Parks to stand up and fight for equality, and this helped lead to the Rosa Parks incident and the Montgomery bus boycott. Emmett Till's death also created widespread media coverage and was even featured in Jet magazine. This led to increased media coverage of the civil rights movement. The Brown versus Board of Education case tied into many of these events.